All right, I want to say welcome to everybody. On behalf of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council, I would like to say welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nicole Ferreira, and I'm the a board member and the current president of the Scappoose Bay Watershed Council. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the council working with our community partners to promote and support a healthy watershed. Over the past 25 years, the council's worked with local landowners and managers to clear 40 fish barriers and open 55 miles of salmon spawning streams. With the help of many volunteers, we planted over 20,000 trees and shrubs to help enhance wildlife habitat and improve the quality of our waterways. We've had the pleasure of working with over 2,500 students and volunteers through our monitoring and assessment programs and our nursery. We are very excited to have Alex Gorman with us from Oregon State University tonight. And he's going to be talking a little bit about the emerald ash borer and how we can be prepared to identify it and who to notify when we see it. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Alex.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So I kind of like this as a smaller group. Sometimes I give this presentation to, just astronomically, I did the master gardeners for the metro area and it's like 200 people. So smaller group, a lot easier to do like nice little discussions. Because I generally, with EAB being so new, like to run the presentation 30 to 40 minutes and leave a little longer for discussions and questions. Because there is a lot we don't know. There's also a lot we do know. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen if I can remember how to do that. I think after 3 years, I figured out. Okay. Can y'all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, from beginning. So like was just said, Alex Gorman, I am an assistant professor of practice. Just a fancy term. I'm an extension forester for Oregon State University, and I cover not only Columbia County, but also Washington and Yamhill counties. And I'm fairly new. I started my role at the end of June. So an emerald ash borer came on the scene like a week and a half later. So I can advance my slides. There we go. So first, before getting into the insect and emerald ash borer, got to talk about its host. And in Oregon, it's really its only host. I'll get into some alternative hosts a little later. But Oregon ash, which is our only native ash tree, so our only native host here in Oregon. Keyword native, there are plenty of other host trees in Oregon, other ash species, but Fraxinus latifolia, it goes up to British Columbia at the very southern end, and then down into Northern California, all the way down to the Sierras. So some quick fun facts about Oregon ash. So they can be multi-trunked, they can be single-trunked, they can grow in really shady environments. They're pretty shade tolerant. They can grow in really saturated soils, and in some cases they're the only thing that grows in these ash swales. They can grow in really aerated soils and they're happy. They can grow in sun. And so it's pretty awesome actually how many different little microclimates this tree can occupy. So our main features of ash trees, just to go, a little review, they have these opposite branching. So as opposed to alternate, like that bottom picture, where sometimes you get a whorl, we have opposite branching, and then they have these big leaflets, and the leaflets, or the leaves are what's composed of all these leaflets, but that's just botanical terms. So this leaf composed of leaflets are oppositely arranged. So unlike a maple would be a palmately, think of your hand, a palm, palmately arranged. Ash trees are pinnately arranged, and they're oppositely, compound. So 80% of our Oregon ash occurs below 1,000 feet, and you might be able to guess that most of that is in the Willamette Valley and along the Columbia River in Columbia County. So what we get, and this applies less to Columbia County as it does to the rest of Oregon ash's range in the state, but we got these really big ash islands, and there certainly are, you can even think of an ash island in a wetland, surrounded by Doug fir. But really these islands of ash, and they're really the only thing that grows in these islands. And Dr. Dave Shaw at OSU had a master's student a few years ago that looked at, okay, what else grows in here, and basically found that 99% of the time nothing else grows in here. Maybe some cascara, maybe some willow, occasionally a white oak. So I'll get into it later, but this kind of gets at an issue of what do we plant after the ash is all dead and gone. But for now, we'll just stick at what ash looks like. This is a picture from inside one of those ash islands, those ash swales, and you can see they're multi-trunked and single-trunked, and some trees are more open, some are more in the shade. So it's really the species can occupy a wide variety of niches. So this is the emerald ash borer, and many of you have probably seen this. It was one of the first resources we put out. It's the risk map. And I do want to give a caveat, a couple big grains of salt, especially looking at the coast and kind of northern Columbia County. This was developed as ash could be here. My extension counterpart over on the coast in Astoria was like, there is an ash there, where it says there's ash there. So, but we can be more confident along the Columbia and the Willamette, and especially on our eastern side of Columbia County. So this is generally where we see the risk popping up, and it's just where the ash is. And we can overlay that, and I think this will be of particular interest to you all with the Watershed Council. We overlay that risk map with the endangered salmonids map, and this is what we get. And so we get a pretty doom and gloom. This is, sorry to say this isn't the most optimistic, upbeat presentation, but we have potential for a large loss of ash. Those trees that are stabilizing banks and keeping sediment out of our streams and cooling our streams down also happens to be where a lot of our salmonids are. Which makes total sense. So really quickly, just want to make sure I didn't skip anything. Yep, let's get into what we see emerald ash borer host as outside of Oregon ash. So white or American ash, pretty common. Green ash, also very common. And these are common as ornamental street trees, landscaping trees. European or common ash, Raywood ash, St. Helens. This is all over the place. All on the railroad tracks in St. Helens, across from, I want to say Les Schwab. It's all Raywood ash. So that's kind of something I've been keeping an eye on. Once that Raywood ash starts to decline, that's going to be a sad thing. We also have European mountain ash. Mountain ash is not a true ash. I got some questions early on from homeowners, landowners saying, okay, is my mountain ash at risk? Nope, it's not. It's in sorbus, only fraxinus. Well, I shouldn't say. There have been laboratory studies that have found that true olives, so which becomes a concern in Southern Oregon, Northern California. You have a lot of olive orchards, olive groves, and then fringe tree, which are both plants along with ash in the Oleaceae, have potential to be hosts. But so far, in situ on the ground, we've only seen ash species be affected. Doesn't mean it can't happen. We just haven't seen it yet. So origins, EAB is native to Eastern Asia, and it likely came over on untreated packing materials, wooden packing materials, which is often how pests and pathogens are traded around the world, is by untreated packing materials. So it showed up, it was detected in Michigan in 2002. It's likely that EAB has been in North America since probably 96 or 98. And so far we've reached 33 states. And I'm really happy that Oregon, put together their readiness and response plan, because it was never a matter of if EAB would arrive in Oregon. It was always when. As we can see, EAB jumped the quarantine in Colorado and just showed up. and was detected in Oregon in Forest Grove at the end of June of 2022. And it's likely, I was out with some ODA specialists looking at some of the infected ash trees in Forest Grove, and it's likely based off the symptoms of those trees and the number of insects that EAB has been in Oregon for probably 5 or 6 years. So a lot longer than initially thought, but it's been here for a good while. But that kind of alludes to the cryptic nature of this insect. It's really hard to tell it's here until it explodes. So to date, emerald ash borer has been North America's most destructive forest pest. It's, like I mentioned, low density, very hard to detect. There's currently no effective, I shouldn't say no, currently all eradication efforts have failed. So we've been able to slow ash mortality, we've been able to slightly knock the insect back, but as far as eradication, it hasn't happened yet. So, and in some instances, and honestly pretty often, we see a greater than 95% mortality, and we've seen a couple 100 million trees die off. So this gets at really high economic cost, and most of that falls, unfortunately, to homeowners, landowners who have ash on their property. But of course, also municipalities, and especially in Columbia County, we have these, small municipalities scattered around that will have to eventually bear that burden of that cost. And then what I mentioned, regarding the salmonid species, and not only our salmonids, but a host of other issues ecologically are going to pop up as we start to lose our ash. So, I'm a visual learner. I always like to include this visual for people. So this is Toledo, Ohio, before EAB in 06. And this is the same street 3 years later in 09. Same time of year. And you can just tell, great foliage, nice full canopies, great crowns. And then 3 years later, totally gone. We can see woodpecker damage on the trees where, the woodpeckers are starting to pick off bark and stuff. And I'll get into signs and symptoms later, but it's a pretty bleak outlook. And I apologize for that nature of the subject, but, without mitigation or treatment, this is what we can expect eventually. So now getting into kind of some very general biology and facts about the insect, and I can always go more in depth later, or send people materials if they're interested. So like I said, EAB can establish on true olive and fringe trees, but that has only so far been observed in the laboratory setting where the insects are forced to infest that way. There's nothing else there. So two of our other really common ash trees that are planted around the state are green ash and white ash. And it's thought that Oregon ash has some resistance in between those two. For all intents and purposes, that means nothing. It's still highly susceptible to the insect. But just for curiosity's sake, that's where it falls. And kind of the big issue when it comes to the nursery stock and to replanting is that the emerald ash borer can infest trees as small as 1 inch in diameter. And so you have really small trees and a really cryptic insect that can easily be moved around on firewood or live trees. So this is where it kind of becomes an issue. So what's fun, not fun, but the larvae of EAB are actually pretty large compared to the adult insects. So we have 3 centimeters as the 4th instar. They call sometimes a J larva because it'll make, before it pupates over winter in the wood, it'll not turn into a J, but it'll bend its head. And they are flathead borers. And so what's really iconic about these wood boring insects is these bell-shaped body segments. So if you ever are looking at an ash and suspect something, you see something and it has a smooth, or it basically doesn't look like it has bell-shaped segments on its body, then it's most likely not EAB. But I guess always better to report than not report. So the adult, they're really quite small. They're 1/4 to a 1/2 inch long at most. At most, they're 1/8 of an inch wide. So they're skinny and they're short. They're really small. They're pretty much, the same color. They're this metallic green. They're objectively really, really pretty and sparkly, and the preserved insects really don't do the live adults justice in terms of that iridescence and that sparkle. But they do have under the elytra this purple underbody, but they, for the most part, the head, the thorax, the abdomen will all be the same color. And you can see here, this is ODA's lookalike sheet, and in red we have our emerald ash borer. The only other small insect that'll look a whole lot like it is the willow gall limb borer, and that's because it's very closely related genetically. It's another agrylus species. But you can see we have a lot of green insects in Oregon. A lot of them are shiny, but most of them are not the same color. And if they're a quarter to a half inch long, they're really not an 1/8 inch wide. And so it's those really key metrics. They're, short and they're not very wide. And here you can see another lookalike comparison of these buprestids, which are our flathead borers. That's a dime, so it can easily fit on a dime. The other buprestids are very common, but you can see, there are golden buprestid is very large and has that red or brown, and then the other buprestid, buprestid langii, is all the same color, but it's gigantic compared to the emerald ash borer. So life cycle, we'll go ahead and start. When the adults select a tree, they'll start flying and emerge. Typically, so this data comes from across the country. We're going to see probably May to September are outliers, and now that we know it's here, we'll take better, we'll collect those data and get those numbers. But it's thought that in Oregon we'll see peak flight in July, and so those females will emerge. They'll eat a bunch of foliage. They won't totally defoliate the ash. They'll just, build up enough resources to go and fly and lay their next brood. And sometimes, so this is the fun thing about emerald ash borer is if there are a lot of ash trees around where the insects emerge, they'll be like, great, there's a tree right there. I'll just go hop to that tree, or I'll stay in the same tree. The more you remove the ash from the area, and this is why we discourage premature cutting, the more you're encouraging the insect to fly. So on average, they'll fly not very far. I mean, we're talking tree to tree, but they have been documented to fly up to 10 miles. And so the more we remove ash or premature cutting, the more we're encouraging insects, the insect to fly. They have a terrifying sense of smell. We'll call it sense of smell. Anyway, eggs are laid, and unlike a lot of wood-boring beetles, these eggs are laid right on the bark. They're laid right in the bark and bark crevices, and then they hatch and they burrow into the bark, and they're so small you're not going to see. So we don't look for entrance holes. What we look for is the emergence holes, the exit holes. And then they overwinter, and they essentially girdle the cambium. They eat all the vascular tissue, the phloem and the xylem, and that's, cuts off the tree's water and nutrient supply. And another interesting thing, and there's another diagram, this one. Also, unlike other wood-boring beetles, this insect does not go very far into the wood, only about an inch. And so they're really right there in between that bark and that wood, and that, that sweet spot of the cambium. So they'll spend their winter munching away, and then they'll emerge. And you can see them in that bottom picture, the head sticking out. And those exit holes are about an 1/8 inch in diameter, because the insect's about an 1/8 of an inch wide. They'll merge, and then it starts all over again. And this on the left side, they mate and fly between 900 and 4 miles. That's on average. That 10 mile was an extreme. It has been documented, but not every insect. It's like a 1% of insects. And this is just a diagram showing the same information, but just kind of how it moves through the tree. So really quickly, I guess not really quickly, but now we'll go into signs and symptoms, because I think it's really important to know what the insect does to the ash trees that allows us to identify, you know, an emerald ash borer infestation, because the adults will fly for a few weeks. So maybe at most we will get an insect flying around, or we'll see adults for 3 months out of the year. Probably be like 2 weeks. So we're really looking at 10 to 11 months of no emerald ash borer adults. But what we do have 12 months out of the year are these signs and symptoms that manifest themselves. So the three really big ones that kind of start to pique my interest and make me, you know, kind of raise an eyebrow and get concerned. The first, canopy thinning and dieback. Most ash trees, I feel like, are sad looking. You know, if you spend enough time in ash, they look sad, especially in the summer. They're summer deciduous. But especially, you know, if we're getting into leaf out in the spring and 3/4 of the crown isn't flushing, that's, you know, should be signaling there's something going wrong with this tree. And then we add an epicormic sprouting, and epicormic sprouting is just a hormonal response to stress that the tree is, you know, going through. And so it sprouts out these vegetative clusters. And so our epicormic sprouting plus our canopy thinning and dieback, that's pretty concerning, because that tree is really stressed. And it could be water tables too high, could be water tables too low, could be a drought, could be heat, could be fungus, could be another insect. But we get to woodpecker damage, and what we'll start seeing, my guess, in Forest Grove is woodpeckers are pretty smart. They'll learn after a year or two, you know, of a large infestation, that there's a pretty good food source underneath that bark. And you'll notice on like sapsuckers or something in this picture, those holes aren't very deep. What they're doing is they're flaking off the bark to get at that very shallow insect, because woodpeckers don't, you know, and what reason this concerns me when I see a tree like this is woodpeckers have no reason flaking the bark off a tree unless there's a really good food source underneath that bark. In the Midwest, we call them ghost trees because, as you can see in this picture, they kind of turns them this ghostly white, and you get these streets and these stands of trees just totally denuded their bark. And then what we see left over from the insect itself, you know, these are all symptoms that the tree either, you know, visually we look at the tree, and as a response of the tree or a bird, these are signs left behind by the emerald ash borer. And so we see on the left are D-shaped exit holes. They're not always going to be perfectly D-shaped, but they'll be generally shaped like a D. Other flat-headed borers and insects will have D-shaped exit holes on ash, but the key is these are 1/8 inch. They're small, and there are bound to be many of them. And they can, you know, I've seen studies that say they really start to congregate these holes on the top of the tree and they work their way down. With Oregon ash, we just don't know yet, and it's likely that really the exit holes are going to pop up anywhere. And so, you know, if you can find an exit hole, great. But you know, if you can get under the bark and look for these S-shaped galleries, that's really going to be kind of the telltale final nail in that coffin. Galleries for insects on trees are like fingerprints. There's a lot of insects that make galleries and will bore through ash, but emerald ash borer does this serpentine, you know, gallery shape where it doesn't change size. It's, you know, so that's what we're looking for. And then sometimes if you have a severe enough infestation, you'll get the bark splitting because the wood underneath is drying out. It's checking like a board would. It's essentially warping and exposing those galleries in underneath the bark. And so sometimes with a heavy enough infestation, we'll see this. You can walk up to a tree and automatically, yep, there's my, you know, my serpentine S-shaped galleries. Let me look for some exit holes. So yeah, and then we're actually finding it's almost easier to find these bark cracks with galleries in the winter without all of the leaves and all the underbrush. But it's a good thing to look out for when you're out and about. So switching gears. And the reason I like to leave so much time at the end for questions, because this is a lot of information. Even when you know, this is how many times I've given this talk, and even I'm like, well, that was a lot of information. So switching gears now, this is kind of like what's going on in Oregon, what are we doing, what's happening, and also then what can we do as land managers and advocates to really help our ash. So what's a thing that's really exciting to come out of this unfortunate situation is this Oregon EAB task force, which is statewide. It's led by Oregon Department of Agriculture, and it's facilitated by the Oregon Invasive Species Council. And I say it's exciting because in a matter of weeks, we got this task force, which is representative, has representatives from more than 40 partner agencies and organizations, and has just been really fantastic to work with and see this happen for invasive species at lightning speed. And I'm not really going to go super into any of these subcommittees, but just to let you know, we have a communications, research, integrated pest management and best management practices subcommittee, a training and technical assistance subcommittee, which I lead, wood waste utilization, surveying and monitoring, and funding. I also sit on the research and integrated pest management and best management practices committee. An exciting thing, and this just came out, so I'm trying it out in this slide. So our IPM BMP committee is really close to releasing it's an 8-page document with a really good FAQ and other information of kind of what to do for land managers and municipalities, unincorporated areas regarding emerald ash borer, especially when it comes to wood waste utilization. So as soon as that comes out, I will be blasting it to everyone who I have an email for. So stay tuned to that, because that'll be really good information that you can then disseminate to your constituents and partners. So really, there are a few things we can do, and it depends on if it's a proactive or a reactive situation. So proactively, systemic insecticides are as close to a silver bullet as we could get. You can remove infested trees, and like I said, we're coming out with this BMP guide, and what it talks about is you can remove dead trees, or if a tree is infested, you can remove that live tree that's been infested. Again, we're really trying to not recommend the premature cutting of ash trees. I personally, I'd like to see the resource, not the resource, but the tree on the landscape as much as possible. And I'd hate for someone to prematurely cut down a 180-year-old ash tree, because it might die. Anyway, so, and then we can manage these trees so they're longer term cycles, and then also biocontrol releases, and I'll get a little more into each of these. So, but first off, so is it safe to move ash wood? Absolutely not. Washington County here pretty soon, we'll probably go into a quarantine, which it's just like, please don't move wood outside of Washington County. And I would start, I'm recommending to all the other counties I talk to that are surrounding Washington County that just it's best, like every other invasive insect, please just don't move wood. I would really also push this to your people, just leave the wood where it is. However, with that being said, we can chip the wood. I just want to make sure. Yep. And if the wood is chipped, it needs to be at least an inch in 2 out of the 3 dimensions. So the smaller the chips, the better, because like I said earlier, this insect can bore into an inch of wood. And so ideally, if you're someone who is going to, let's say, mill the ash for, wood to make cutting boards or to build out of, you would want to peel the bark off and the wood up to an inch. But chipping, we want to chip it down to an inch, because as soon as we expose that larvae to the inhospitable conditions like a wood chip, it'll desiccate and die pretty quickly. We can also kiln dry, and ODA and USDA APHIS have really good solid kind of guidelines for kiln drying ash wood, both for firewood or for use. I won't go into fumigated and incinerated. Well, incinerated, just, you can burn the wood. So like I said, treatments, chemical, and this is just a picture. I'm OSU and myself are by no means endorsing Arbor Jet. It's just a good visual picture. Tree injections are really the best preventative. You can also do soil drenches. Soil drenches are, I guess, they can be nice because they're bought over the counter. Anyone can go into any big box store or whatever and buy soil drenches. Tree injections have to be done by certified arborists, and they're also very costly. You can see $100 to $300 per tree. It's as the tree gets bigger, the more injections you need. It's pretty complicated. I will say the nice thing about the tree injections is they have a 95% efficacy and can last up to 3 years. And this is all, where it says 1 to 3 years, that's really dependent on pest pressure. If you have a billion insects in your area, you're probably going to do it every year. If you have one infected tree or a couple, maybe every 3 years. Compared to soil drenches, this is kind of where soil drenches lose their attractiveness, is you need to do them every year. And I like to give the dramatic example of, you could do a soil drench every year for 20 years and keep your ash trees alive. But if someone misses that 21st year, game's over. That protective barrier is just a year, as an annual basis. So there's a give and a take. But chemical treatments are not feasible on a large scale. This is for, street trees, or a landowner that has, I just visited a Yamhill County landowner that has a 180-year-old ash tree, and it's big and fantastic. And I was like, you might think about treating this one tree. You're not really going to have any success or, effectiveness if you're trying to treat systemically a bunch of, wrist-sized ash trees over 100 acres. It would also cost a fortune. So biocontrol, we have tiny parasitic wasps, and I always like to give the the caveat that these are very small wasps. They're very hard to see with the naked eye. They don't sting humans. They don't bite humans. They pose no threat to us. They do pose a threat to the emerald ash borer. They either, depending on what kind of species, there's about 4 or 5 species that we can use. They'll either parasitize the eggs or they'll parasitize the larvae. And it's kind of interesting. For the larvae, they'll actually fly up to the bark of an ash tree, and based off the vibrations of the larvae munching on the wood, the wasp can determine, it's a healthy larvae that I can parasitize. However, we only have about a quarter to a third of the time the parasites actually take hold and will do anything. 21 to 35% parasitism rate. ODA and APHIS are looking at release sites in Washington County, because who knows, maybe we're early enough in the infestation in Oregon that parasitoids might actually work. But as of now, based on the data from the East Coast and the Midwest, I would not put all my eggs in this basket. So how, like I just mentioned, this is just a visualization of how these wasps interact with the emerald ash borer in its life cycle, so either the larvae or the eggs. So what can be planted is always, it's really been my number one question, which is a hard question to answer because we have a decent idea of what we can plant in these sites. At least the sites that aren't super totally clay and anaerobic, but we don't have any studies or any research that really shows treatment effectiveness or anything like that. So it's a really fine line. But you can see here, this is in this picture, this is an ash swale in the Willamette. And so some species that could be planted: cottonwood, big leaf maple, Oregon white oak, western red cedar. And before I get to the next slide, what I like to kind of pose to landowners, to land managers, to people who work around ash is take stock of what ash you have now or that you're working with, and then after an EAB infestation rolls through, what do you want that resource to look like afterwards? be it ash or no ash. And a big thing with planting other species is, we can plant a bunch of species, but I like to have people start to think, do they want a forest or something green there for the sake of having a forest there? Meaning we could plant a bunch of, Willamette Valley pine in a wet area, and it'll probably grow, but it'll completely change the biochemistry of that site. Or do you want a species that'll kind of fill a similar ecological role and niche as close to ash as it can? And so Shoals Valley put together this nice document, and I apologize for the quality of the photo. But essentially on the left side, of the sliding scale, we have really wet soils, and on the right side, we have really dry soils. And these are just kind of where, and in these clay kind of glade soils, what might work. And so we see Oregon white oak, is kind of one of my favorites. It can handle a lot of microclimates, as opposed to, Doug fir can't. Doug fir doesn't like wet feet, doesn't like its roots being in water most of the time. OSU Extension is working with the task force to, maybe come out with a fact sheet, but that's in very, very, very preliminary stages. We're just chatting about it right now, so stay tuned for more on that. But bottom line, and again, not to be negative, but it's the most expensive pest so far in U.S. history. As of 2021, there's no federal quarantine because, no surprise, it's pretty difficult to keep people from moving wood. Quarantine really is just for nurseries, but also it just, a lot of states still have quarantines, and we're going to see probably within, 5 to 10 years, a lot more. It's going to become exponential. There's this high risk to both communities and municipalities, landowners, that cost of ash, which is why I'm haven't talked about it a whole lot, but this concept of slowing ash mortality, doing those treatments, because delaying ash mortality delays those costs and spreads those costs out over time. But also from an ecological standpoint, we're going to see some pretty big impacts, most likely, to our riparian forests. So here's a fun list of resources. I'm happy to send emails and link all of these. They're also OISC has a webpage, but if you go to our extension, our forestry natural resources extension, you can get linked to a bunch of great stuff. So that's it. Looks like we're just about at 40 after, which is perfect because I like to leave, like I said, a good amount of time for questions, if any, in this discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. Greg, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Well, this is a kind of a disturbing. I just started hearing about this, I think, about 6 months ago or so. But can you tell us where has it been documented in Oregon so far? And a lot of the areas within the Scappoose Bay watershed are prime or Oregon ash areas. Savi's Island, Dalton Lake Nature Preserve. I mean, just a lot of our lowland wetland areas are just filled with it. So it's very concerning to hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. As soon as, because it's been around, well, it's been around for, like I said, probably 6 years, but yeah. I'm pulling up, is this what I want? Yep. So let me share my screen again. This is something we've been using for the task force. Let's see. So just so far, so this is all of these surveyed locations thus far in the state. And this is, ODA, ODF, USDA, and then municipalities and other organizations. So far, we're only seeing our positive, which is the kind of magenta red and the dark red, still in this Forest Grove area.
Okay.
So far, and these yellow outside of Hillsborough and Newburgh are suspects, and I've been told in Beaverton are potentially well, I'm not going to speak to the unlikeliness or likeliness of it, but we're really only seeing it still around Hillsborough. And I haven't, I've been looking, in our Columbia County area, haven't seen I see sat ash, but nothing yet in terms of sign. That may change come the spring, when we see things start to leaf out and we're like, oh wow, all of the ash along Highway 30 in St. Helens is not leafing out. But yeah, Greg, it's that, yeah, there's a lot of ash in the Scappoose Bay watershed. When you start thinking of the gravity of it, it gets a little daunting and pretty grim.
Yeah, so from what we're seeing from the East Coast, does it seem like the ash borer will go after the maybe genetically weaker ornamental species first, and that some of the nursery grown species are going to be the ones that kind of create the stepping stones for it to go into other communities and then start looking at the native ash more? Hard to say, right?
Yeah, it could. I kind of like to think about it. I like chocolate. I like milk chocolate, dark chocolate, chocolate with almonds. If all three are in front of me, I'll go for the dark chocolate first, but I'll eat whatever chocolate's in front of me. And the emerald ash borer is kind of the same way. It doesn't really, we kind of get to, they've done some actually pretty cool common garden studies in the Midwest where they planted all of the 16 native ash species in North America and kind of just said, have at it, let's see what they eat first. But it's we're not going to see any delayed infestation because they'll go after certain trees first. What we will see, trees that are more stressed will likely get infested first. They're giving out those volatile compounds and those basically signals that say, help, I'm stressed, which the ash borer can pick up from a terrifying distance. And so we might actually see our naturalized forested streamside ash be infested first because maybe the water table is too high and that stressed them out, versus someone who is watering and fertilizing their ash tree every year. And that ash tree isn't stressed at all. So it's hard to say, but the more stress a tree is, the more likely it will be infested compared to a thriving unstressed tree.
Mhm.
Alex, in their native habitat in Asia, have the ash trees there developed a resistance to this thing in some fashion?
Absolutely. It's just like I'm trying to think, like our Doug fir beetle here, or something where when all is fine and well, doesn't really bug the tree species. We'll see some dead trees, and then occasionally we'll see these boom and bust cycles, and the same thing happens in the emerald ash borer's native range. It doesn't cause huge issues. But of course, our North American ash don't have the same resistance. And so it's just completely just fair, everything's fair game as far as the insect's concerned, because they're all super susceptible. I guess with blue ash, which is over like Pennsylvania, Ohio, has some resistance, not a lot, but a little bit. And of course, there are a bunch of genetic research and studies going on. ODF had the wherewithal and foresight to collect. I think they have they have some astronomical amount of ash seed from Oregon ash's range to hopefully look at some genetic diversity and any resistance. So, we'll just have to wait and see. But that's also a good question.
When you were talking about the chemical treatments that could be used with the injections, is there any fallout with other species of insect? How targeted is that application, and what do you know anything about like the half-life, and if it's going into the cambium layer and into the vascular structure of the tree, it's also going into the soil for the extent of the tree's root plate?
Yeah, so it doesn't have, it's pretty targeted, not necessarily at EAB, but it's that mode. So the insects have to be chewing on the cambium to ingest that. It's not a neonicotinoid. And there hasn't been a whole lot of documentation of non-target impacts. It's my understanding that as soon as that emamectin benzoate, that chemical, gets into the leaves and the flowers, it kind of just is what's the word, it's kind of done. It doesn't really have, so it's a fairly short half-life as I understand it. It's not, it doesn't cause huge kill-off in bees like we see other chemicals. So it's fairly, as far as chemicals go, fairly good at really only killing off EAB.
Alex, what is soil drenching? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. So it really, at the simplest it is mix it a bunch of pellets of chemical in a 5-gallon bucket and pour it on your soil above the roots.
Yeah, you can do the same thing, Greg, with fertilizer applications. I do that with fish fertilizer and other amendments that I'm adding to various things around my garden.
Alex, do you mind, the common phrase I've heard with a couple of restoration project managers is that in the next 10 years, that's when we're really going to see the landscape change. Is that when we're going to see 90% of the ash depleted from Oregon? Or are we looking at a much shorter timeline?
That's a good question, Emily. It's really hard to say. I would agree. I would say 5 to 10 years, maybe 5 to 15. But it really just, depends on how far it spreads. This is, the first time in North America the insect has been in an area with such mild winters. So we don't yet know if it'll have 2 broods a year or if it's just one, like it is in the Midwest and East Coast. But I would say that's pretty online with what my thinking is, because these ash trees aren't going to disappear overnight. It's going to take time for the stands to, it's kind of reverse, the big trees will die, then it'll just kind of keep dying off. So it, but also it could explode. It could get, we're just now finding new infestations in riparian corridors of like the Tualatin River. And if that really explodes and gets down into, larger parts of the Columbia, it could just take off. But yeah, I'd say 5 to 15 years, probably 10, until we start seeing just stands of dead skeleton trees along the I-5 corridor, along Highway 30. So, but it's hard to say.
So what does that mean for some of the insect species that depend on the ash trees?
So another great question. It turns out we don't know a whole lot about Oregon ash and what insects and fungi depend on it. It's really, we started, a few of my extension colleagues and I in the College of Forestry are coming out with an extension publication that's like, okay, this is the insects, the fungi, and the kind of biotic, abiotic factors of Oregon ash. And we're like, in doing our literature review, we're like, wow, there's really not been much documentation. This has really kind of been a just Passover tree. Which is, it has great, cultural value, especially to, just people for paddles and stuff. But as far as just trees go, people don't know a whole lot about it. Not a lot of research has been done. But, of course, if, there are some insects that solely depend on that tree. And once that tree is gone, then, if the insects don't adapt to find, alternate hosts, which most do, then we'll start seeing a loss of those. those trees. And we, even in Europe, we're seeing some fungal species kind of start to disappear, dwindle in numbers because they're ash dependent and the ash is disappearing. So it has a lot of compounding factors.
Right, but the great thing about the fungi is that they can go into spore form for hundreds of years and then be reactivated later on. They're
Correct. Yep.
fairly resilient that way.
Yeah, there are a number. It depends on the species, but yeah, especially soil dependent. But well, unless they're mycorrhizal, or if they're ectomycorrhizal, then it doesn't matter if the spore is there or not. If the tree is in there, they can't do anything. But the disease fungi can, which is fun for them.
Well, are there any other questions for Alex? We're getting close to our hour time. Hearing none. Alex, thank you so much for coming out tonight and giving us the presentation. Is it possible to get a copy of your slides?
Yeah, I can send over a PDF of the slides.
That'd be great. Some of the graphics on there were super informative. I really liked the one that the group put together about the tree species.
Yeah, me too.
Going across soil type and water needs. And
yeah, absolutely. Yes. Awesome. Write that down so don't forget.
Fantastic. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.